A marriage that once looked unbreakable did not end because love disappeared. It ended because love was no longer enough to survive a hidden world that was never meant to be touched. Beneath the surface of perfection, something dangerous had been quietly pulling two lives in opposite directions until separation became the only form of protection left. Alyssa Carter was once known for her calm elegance and quiet confidence, a woman who carried herself with grace even when life was uncertain. After the divorce, that image remained on the outside, but inside she was fractured in ways no one could see. The world saw a woman who had moved on. In reality, she was someone who had learned how to hide pain behind stillness. Her marriage had not ended in betrayal or anger. It had ended in silence, urgency, and fear that neither of them fully explained. There were nights filled with unanswered questions, warnings that were never spoken directly, and decisions made under pressure from forces that never showed their full identity. The truth remained buried beneath everything they were forced to leave behind. There were subtle signs even then that her husband's world was not ordinary. Phone calls that ended too quickly, unexplained absences, and moments where his gaze carried weight he never shared. Alyssa never fully understood it at the time, only that something dangerous existed beyond what she was allowed to know. When the separation happened, it was sudden. Not a collapse of love, but a forced distance shaped by fear. He disappeared from her life completely afterward, leaving no explanation that could close the emotional gap he left behind. The absence felt intentional, but never clarified. Alyssa relocated to a quieter city, attempting to rebuild a life that no longer had its original foundation. She worked, she functioned, and she survived, but she did not open herself to anything new. Relationships became impossible to imagine. Trust became something that belonged to a version of herself that no longer existed. Over time, her emotional world froze. 6 years passed in a rhythm of routine and avoidance. She told herself she had moved forward, but every quiet moment carried echoes of what she lost. Flashbacks surfaced without warning, small fragments of laughter, distant memories of safety, and the sharp contrast between love that once felt real and fear that ended it. To everyone around her, she was someone who had healed, someone who had moved on cleanly from the past. But healing had never truly happened. Only survival had. The deeper question that never left her mind was why he had vanished so completely. No contact, no explanation, no closure. Only silence where answers should have been. One afternoon, while flipping through a luxury business magazine, Alyssa paused at a page that changed everything. A symbol printed beside a corporate profile felt disturbingly familiar, as if it belonged to a memory she had spent years trying to bury. Her breath slowed as recognition turned into disbelief. The symbol belonged to the man she had been told to forget. She rebuilt her life, but she never rebuilt her heart. What looked like stability from the outside was actually a carefully controlled existence built on emotional silence rather than healing. Alyssa Carter had learned how to function without breaking, but not how to feel without remembering. In New York's high-end corporate world, she was known as composed, intelligent, and consistently reliable. Her presence carried authority in meetings, her work earned respect in elite circles, and her discipline made her stand out in a competitive environment. Yet none of that success reached the part of her that had gone quiet years ago. People around her saw strength. They saw a woman who had overcome a difficult past and emerged independent. What they did not see was the distance she kept between herself and every relationship that tried to form around her. Alyssa never allowed closeness to develop. Emotional connection had become something she treated like a risk rather than a comfort. Her days were structured to avoid silence that could trigger memory. Even small reminders could pull fragments of the past back into focus. A familiar phrase, a certain tone in conversation, or a corporate symbol that resembled something she once knew but refused to name aloud. She had trained herself to move past those moments quickly, as if ignoring them could reduce their weight. The divorce papers still existed in a hidden part of her life, not physically present but emotionally untouched. Thinking about them brought back the same confusion she had never resolved. The ending had not made sense then, and it made even less sense now. Occasionally, News headlines mentioning organized crime or underground power structures would catch her attention against her will. She avoided reading them, but the brief exposure was enough to create unease. There was something in those stories that felt too close to something she had once been forced to forget. Her friends admired her independence. They described her as someone who had mastered control over her life and emotions. But what they mistook for strength was actually emotional numbness carefully maintained over time. Alyssa had not healed. She had simply learned how to function around what still hurt. The internal contradiction defined her existence. Professionally, she was advancing. Personally, she was paused in time, anchored to a version of herself that no longer had closure. Then the pattern changed. Mysterious invitations began arriving for elite business events. Gatherings that were too exclusive to be random. First she ignored them. Then one arrived with a symbol printed subtly in the corner of the invitation. A design she could not immediately place, but one her memory reacted to before her logic could intervene. Her control began to fracture in small, unspoken ways. Against her better judgment, she accepted one invitation. Only after confirming her attendance did she learn the location. It was a place she had once visited with the man she was told to forget. The man she lost did not disappear. He evolved into something far more dangerous than absence, something structured, powerful, and impossible to escape even from memory. Damian Romano had become a name spoken only in controlled rooms and cautious conversations. To the public, he did not truly exist in a clear form. His influence did. His decisions did. But the man himself remained hidden behind layers of legitimacy built from corporate fronts and carefully constructed silence. He ruled a network that operated beneath international business systems, where legal companies served as masks for an empire that extended across cities and industries. Every move was calculated. Every expansion was precise. Nothing about his world was left to chance. Outwardly, Damian was controlled to the point of emotional invisibility. He spoke when necessary, acted without hesitation, and never allowed personal history to surface in public spaces. That restraint was not peace. It was discipline built from loss. Within underground networks, he was feared not for chaos, but for order. He did not destroy recklessly. He replaced instability with structure. That was what made him more dangerous than those who acted on emotion. Rumors followed him quietly. Whispers suggested he had once lost someone important, a connection that shaped the way he now ruled everything around him. No one confirmed it, and no one dared ask directly. In Damian Romano's world, curiosity often came with consequences. What no one saw was that control did not equal healing. He avoided any mention of his past marriage completely, as if speaking it would fracture the carefully maintained boundary between who he was and who he used to be. Even in moments alone, he never allowed himself to fully revisit what was lost. But memory was not something even power could eliminate. His empire continued to grow through hidden influence, alliances, acquisitions, and silent removals of obstacles that threatened stability. Loyalty surrounded him, but it was loyalty built on fear of his precision, not comfort in his presence. A new elite business event forced him into limited public visibility again, a controlled appearance meant to reinforce legitimacy. He agreed without resistance, as he always did when the situation served a purpose beyond emotion. But just before the event, intelligence reached him. Name. Possibility. A disruption from the past he had spent years containing. For the first time in a long while, his internal control shifted. Not broken but disturbed. The past was no longer distant enough to ignore. It was approaching again. And when the guest list was finalized, Damian Romano saw something that stopped all movement for a fraction of a second. Alyssa Carter's name was there. Two broken souls stood inside the same room, pretending they were strangers in a world that no longer felt safe for either of them. Alyssa Carter arrived at the elite business gala with no understanding of what truly surrounded her. The venue was polished, expensive, and filled with people who carried influence like currency. Wealth moved through conversations. Hidden agendas shaped every handshake, and nothing in the room existed without purpose. She felt it immediately, even before she understood it. Her presence was careful, controlled, and distant. She had accepted the invitation believing it was a professional opportunity, but the atmosphere carried something heavier than business. There was an unspoken structure beneath the elegance, something that made her instincts quietly alert without giving her a clear reason. Damien Romano arrived separately, as he always did. He did not enter rooms. He shifted their attention. Conversations slowed without stopping, people adjusted their posture without realizing it, and security presence subtly repositioned itself around his arrival. His control was silent, automatic, and absolute. Then it happened. A single moment of visual contact. Across the room, without warning or intention, their eyes met. Time did not stop, but it changed. The space between them lost its noise. The crowd, the music, the movement, all of it blurred into something distant and irrelevant. Alyssa felt her breath catch as recognition hit her before logic could respond. Something in her mind cracked open, pulling forward memories she had buried for years. Shock came first, then confusion, then a quiet emotional collapse she refused to show outwardly. Damien remained still. His expression did not change, but something inside him shifted sharply, as if a locked part of his past had been forced open without permission. Control did not leave him, but it wavered for the first time in years. Neither of them moved toward each other. Neither of them spoke. But recognition did not require permission. Flashbacks surfaced in fragments, brief, uninvited memories of a life that once existed between them. Not loud or detailed, but emotional enough to disturb the present. The world around them continued functioning, unaware that something in the room had fundamentally changed. The crowd still moved, still spoke, still celebrated. Yet the invisible balance of the room shifted. People near Damien adjusted instinctively, sensing a change in his attention. Security presence subtly increased around him without explanation. A warning reached him moments later from one of his closest men. Her presence, they said, was not safe for his position, not safe for his empire, not controllable in the way everything else in his world was. Damien did not respond to the warning. He did not acknowledge it. His attention remained fixed on Alyssa, as if ignoring the risk was easier than stepping away from what had already returned. Alyssa, overwhelmed by tension she could not name, suddenly felt her phone vibrate. A private message appeared on the screen with no sender identification. It contained only a single instruction: leave immediately. The divorce was never what Alyssa Carter believed it was. That realization did not arrive as a single truth, but as fragments that slowly began to rearrange everything she thought she understood about her past. After the gala encounter, Alyssa could no longer dismiss what she felt. Damien Romano's presence had reopened questions she had buried for 6 years. The emotional stability she had carefully built started to fracture, not through chaos but through doubt. She began revisiting memories she had avoided for too long, searching for patterns that had once seemed meaningless. What she found was unsettling. Financial traces, indirect corporate ties, and hidden legal overlaps connected Damien's world to the timeline of her divorce. Nothing was obvious, nothing was direct, but everything pointed toward controlled separation rather than emotional collapse. The structure suggested planning, not abandonment. For the first time, a disturbing possibility formed in her mind. What if the divorce had not been the end of their story, but a forced interruption designed for protection? Confusion replaced anger in a way she was not prepared for. The narrative she had lived with for years no longer held firm ground. Every assumption began to feel unstable, as if she had been given only part of the truth. What Alyssa did not realize was that Damien Romano was already watching from a distance. Not in a way that revealed himself, but in a way that controlled space around her without direct contact. When unknown individuals began to drift too close during her movements outside the venue, they were redirected before she even noticed the danger. It became clear, slowly and quietly, that she had never truly been left alone. Her life after the divorce had not been empty by accident. It had been shaped, carefully, deliberately, into something safer than it appeared. The idea unsettled her more than fear would have. If she had been protected, then who had decided what she was allowed to know? Alyssa started noticing patterns she had ignored before. Car that seemed to appear too often. People who subtly adjusted their path when she moved. Moments where threats seemed to vanish before reaching her. It was not obvious enough to confirm, but too consistent to ignore. She realized she was being watched, but not harmed. That realization created a deeper tension than danger itself. Protection and control began to blur together. She could not tell if she was being saved or contained. Far away from her direct awareness, Damien struggled with the same conflict. Revealing the truth meant risking everything he had built to keep her safe. Staying silent meant continuing a life where she misunderstood him completely. For the first time in years, control did not feel like strength, it felt like burden. He chose silence again. But silence had consequences. Outside the venue that night, Alyssa stepped into what she believed was safety. Instead, she was surrounded too quickly by unfamiliar movement. Too close, too coordinated, too intentional. Before she could react, unknown men intervened with precision, removing the threat in seconds. And in their presence, she realized something that changed everything. They were not strangers. They were moving like they belonged to Damien Romano. Her return did not just reopen a past, it activated enemies she had never known existed. Within hours of Alyssa Carter's reappearance in Damien Romano's orbit, quiet signals began moving through underground networks. Rival factions that operated in silence recognized the shift immediately. Her name carried no public power, but in the hidden world connected to Damien, her presence carried consequences. At first, Alyssa did not understand why things around her began to change. Subtle security adjustments followed her movements. Unknown cars appeared too often in her environment. Strangers changed direction when she passed. Nothing was openly violent, but everything felt coordinated in a way that made her increasingly aware that she was no longer just an ordinary civilian in an elite corporate space. She had become a point of interest. And in that world, attention was never neutral. Damien Romano's empire responded without announcement. There were no visible alarms, no public warnings, only silent adjustments made across layers of control. Protection systems activated in places Alyssa never saw. Threats were redirected before they reached her. Situations dissolved before they could form. To outsiders, nothing appeared different. But underground, influence shifted like a locked mechanism being tightened. Alyssa began to feel it, being watched without being approached, followed without being confronted. The most disturbing part was not danger itself, but the precision with which danger avoided her. That precision led to confusion. Why was she important enough to require this level of control? When she confronted Damien indirectly, seeking answers through distance and tension rather than direct confrontation, she received nothing. Not denial, not explanation, only silence. Damien understood the risk of truth. Explaining the full structure of his world meant exposing her to a reality that could permanently change how she saw everything, including him. So he chose what he always chose when the stakes involved her safety. Silence as protection. But silence did not resolve tension. Deepened it. Inside Damien, a conflict grew sharper. One side demanded transparency, believing truth might eventually bring understanding. The other side insisted that knowledge would only endanger her further. Neither side could fully dominate the other, and that internal division made his control feel less absolute than before. Meanwhile, rival factions began using her presence as leverage. Not through direct contact, but through pressure points, messages, indirect movements, and strategic proximity designed to test Damien's response. Every reaction he made revealed more than he intended. Alyssa started noticing patterns she could no longer dismiss. She was not just being protected. She was being positioned within something much larger than she had ever imagined. Her past marriage was no longer a personal memory. It was beginning to look like part of a hidden structure she was never told about. And then the truth shifted again. One night, she was quietly informed by someone she did not recognize that, in underground Mafia records, she had once been listed under a designation she never expected to hear. A marked identity tied directly to Damian Romano. Protected property. Love does not disappear in Mafia worlds. It waits quietly behind violence, control, and time, only resurfacing when the world becomes unstable enough to let it breathe again. Alyssa Carter finally confronted Damian Romano in a private space removed from the chaos around them. The tension between them was no longer silent distance. It had become something heavier, something that demanded truth instead of avoidance. Every second between them carried years of unanswered questions. For once, Damian's control showed a fracture. Not in weakness, but in restraint breaking under emotional pressure. The man who had ruled criminal empires without hesitation now stood in front of the only person who could disrupt that control completely. His usual precision remained, but his silence no longer felt empty, it felt burdened. What emerged was not a full confession, but something closer to emotional truth. He had never stopped loving her. The separation, the silence, the disappearance from her life. It had not been rejection. It had been protection shaped by threats she was never meant to see. Assassination risks, internal betrayals, and power struggles inside his world had made her presence beside him a vulnerability he could not allow. So he removed her from the equation. Not from his life. From danger. Alyssa struggled to process what she was hearing. Love and fear collided inside her understanding of the past. Every memory she once associated with abandonment began shifting into something more complicated. Nothing felt simple anymore, not even pain. Fragments of their marriage resurfaced in her mind. Moments of safety she had not understood at the time, glances she had once misread, and silences that now carried different meaning. Emotional clarity did not arrive cleanly. It arrived in waves of confusion and recognition. Trust, once completely broken, began to rebuild, but slowly, carefully, as if afraid of collapsing again under its own weight. But the world around them did not pause for reconciliation. Rival factions moved closer as Damian prepared for a final confrontation he had been anticipating for years. Every decision he made now carried double weight. Leadership and protection. Alyssa was no longer outside his world observing from distance. She was inside it whether she wanted to be or not. That shift changed everything. Emotional intensity between them reached a dangerous peak. Not because they had resolved the past, but because they were now standing inside it with no separation left between memory and reality. Damian knew the risks were increasing. Alyssa sensed it too, even without being told. The space they occupied together felt like the calm before structural collapse. For a brief moment, it almost felt like peace was possible again. Then the silence broke. An assassination attempt struck during their private meeting, shattering whatever fragile stability had just formed between them. Love becomes the most dangerous weapon in their world when it is no longer something that protects, but something that exposes. The assassination attempt shattered the fragile moment between Alyssa Carter and Damian Romano, forcing reality back into violence and instinct. What had almost become emotional clarity transformed instantly into survival. The attackers moved with precision, not chaos, signaling that this was not random. It was coordinated against Damian's existence itself. Alyssa was directly targeted in the confusion. That single fact changed Damian's response from controlled defense to absolute action. For the first time, the truth behind her past divorce was revealed fully, without hesitation or protection through silence. Damian admitted what he had hidden for years. Their separation had never been abandonment. It had been calculated removal. A decision made under constant threat, where keeping her close would have marked her for elimination. He chose distance so she could live. Not because he stopped loving her, but because loving her openly inside his world had been a death sentence waiting to happen. The emotional weight of that truth hit Alyssa harder than fear. Everything she had interpreted as loss now carried the possibility of sacrifice. Anger, confusion, and grief collided in a single moment of overwhelming realization. Damian did not ask for forgiveness. He did not expect understanding. But in that moment, the emotional barrier between them finally collapsed. Alyssa made her choice. Despite everything, the danger, the violence, the hidden war, she chose to stand beside him instead of stepping away. Not because fear disappeared, but because truth had changed its meaning. Walking away no longer meant safety. It meant ignorance. With her decision, the balance of power inside Damien's world shifted. The final confrontation between his empire and rival forces unfolded rapidly. What had been building for years collapsed into a controlled, silent elimination of threats. No public chaos followed. No external awareness spread. The world outside remained unaware that a war had just ended beneath its surface. Order was restored within the hidden hierarchy Damien controlled. The last opposing force was removed quietly, without spectacle, leaving no trace of the conflict that had nearly destroyed everything. Alyssa, now fully inside his world, no longer existed as an outsider. She had become part of the structure he once tried to keep her away from, and part of the life he could no longer separate himself from. Together, they began rebuilding something fragile but real. Not a return to the past, but an understanding built on truth, sacrifice, and acceptance of everything that had been hidden between them. Love had survived, but it had not become safe. It had become aware. And somewhere far beyond their rebuilt silence, in another city untouched by their resolution, someone watched their names surface in a new report, studying them with patience, calculation, and intent. A new enemy had already begun preparing what came next.